I've got a bike, you can ride it if you like. It's got a basket, a bell and rings and things to make it look good.
Hello and welcome again. We're going to continue right on in with the text of 1 Corinthians 15, but let it be said here in the beginning that I'm not dealing with every objection Don K. Preston would raise. There's a lot of material here that simply just cannot be covered. What I'm wanting to do, though, is to go through 1 Corinthians 15 and give kind of a positive view as to what the traditional or historical orthodox church teaches. Suffice it to say that Don K. Preston believes that physical resurrection of the dead has absolutely nothing to do with this text in any way, shape, or form, and that's what is known as the full preterist position, which is heretical to the church and what the church has traditionally or taught in orthodoxy, or what's recited in the creeds on Sundays in the historic church. And they counter this, whereas we have been arguing on the positive note that Paul is rather affirming resurrection of the body, that the saints that die or fall asleep in Christ will also be raised again. And we covered that as Paul has first emphasized the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus was raised bodily, he died, he was buried, his body was buried, he was buried, and he was risen again from the dead. And Paul uses the verb here in verse 20, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep in him. And that would include any of us who fall asleep or pass away, because that is the enemy. And that's what Paul now, first in his narratio, is stating the resurrection of Jesus, the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the man, and the man is never to be lost focus of here. Secondly, he's going to make his argument in forms of what is called modus tollens. He's going to make this kind of an argument of an if-then. If this is the case, then this is the case. Because Jesus' resurrection and the future resurrection of the dead are so linked together that to deny one would be to deny the other. And that's Paul's argument. If you deny this one, then whether you affirm it or not, you have to deny the resurrection of Jesus. And then he says with this, if only in this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than above all men. And he's going to answer why that's important. If we have hope only in this life, and we pass on, and this body is not restored, it's not raised, it's not transformed at the resurrection of the dead on the last day, if that's the case, then Paul says, you know, we're to be most pitied above all men, because that is the very thing that he is teaching. Is that the hope cannot be transferred into the next life if it does not involve this life. And to disconnect this life from the life that is to come, which is resurrection of the dead, to separate those two so that there's no connection between them, for Paul is anathema. What that means is, some would say, well, our bodies, this body dies that we have in this life, this body dies, but we get a new body when we die and we go to heaven. But that won't do. And Paul's going to say why it won't do. If it's stated that this body dies, and like the Greek view, Plato, and the soul continues on, but resurrection of the body of this life, this body, is not going to happen. Again, for Paul, that's anathema. That's not what he's teaching here. And now he's going to explain why that this is very important. He says, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. Who have fallen asleep. And it's interesting, those who have fallen asleep and are still asleep. In other words, they're dead. That can only be spoken of their bodies. Their bodies have slept. It's the euphemism. They're in the tomb in those days, in the tomb or catacombs or whatever. Paul's writing in the mid-50s somewhere at the time of the letter of the Corinthian church. And so they've fallen asleep in Christ. And they're still asleep in Christ at the time of Paul's writing. And so he says, here's the reason. That's the reason. Since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. For as in Adam all are dying, so in Christ all will be, future, made alive. Now let's stop right there. He gives the very reason why. In Adam, we're all dying, and that's a present tense that he uses here in the Greek tense, the Greek text. We're all dying. In other words, death came through Adam, and that takes us, of course, back to Genesis chapter 1. Death entered in, and that's Romans chapter 5, too, where Paul says that through man, death entered in, and sin did reign in the death. Death came in. Sin came in this life. He's talking about us in this life. We die, because in Adam all are dying. And so death becomes the reason why resurrection of the dead, which is the reversal of that which came through the man Adam. And the effect of what came through the man Adam was the fact that we all are dying. We all die. Death is a direct result of what came through the one man, Adam. Physical death is a direct result of what came through the one man, Adam. In other words, his sin and the sin that reigned in that death that has come to us all because we all die is the effect that came through the one man, Adam. So physical death is the result of his sin, and it will not do to have our souls continue in existence and this not be raised. If this is claimed, because we die in Adam, if this is claimed by the death that came through Adam, and it is not reclaimed, it is not raised from the dead, then Paul's saying Jesus has not been raised either. Because the very purpose that he came, the very reason why he was raised bodily from the dead, because in 1 Timothy it says that he has destroyed death in and of himself as a human being, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. He has been risen from the dead. In Romans chapter 6, he can die no more because death has no more mastery over him. Now, if our souls just continue on into eternal glory and our bodies are not raised, but yet our bodies is the effect of the death that came through Adam, then how is that a reversal of that which came through Adam? Jesus will stop at nothing but victory. Total victory. Total victory. And he goes on to say here, but each in his own turn, Christ the firstfruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. And then he says, after he has destroyed all dominion and authority, and then the last enemy to be destroyed is death. See, death is to be destroyed. Well, what death? It says over here Jesus was buried, Jesus died, he was buried, and he was raised again from the dead. And he remains risen from the dead. So it also says that in Adam all are dying. That would include Paul. That would include those that he's writing to. That would include those that are listening to me. And that would include me. I am dying right now. You're dying. If you're listening to me, you're dying. I'm dying. I'm heading towards the tomb. I'm heading towards the grave. That's where I'm going. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. There's no stopping it. I can't do anything about it. I am powerless when it comes to dying. That came from Adam. And I'm dying in my body. Jesus died in his body. And Jesus' body was risen again from the dead. And death has no more mastery over him in that he cannot die anymore. That cannot be said of us. Even though I fall asleep in Christ, my promise is in Christ, who is the first fruit. See, he's the one who has gone ahead of us. He's the first fruit. But Jesus, in the victory of Jesus, is to swallow up death, is to destroy the last enemy, death. The death that came through the one man, and the effect of that death is that all men are dying because of that. Dying how? I'm dying in my body. Resurrection of the dead then is tied to the reversal of that, which came through the one man Adam. Resurrection of the dead is tied to the reversal of that. So it will not do to say that my soul continues on in heaven, and there is no resurrection of the dead. Resurrection of the body. It will not do to say that when I die, I get a brand new body when I go to heaven, because that body never experienced death. And Paul is going to make that very, very clear when we go on and in the following verses. He's going to make it clear that it is the body that is raised, And it is the body that is transformed, because it is the body that is affected directly by the sin that came through Adam, in which all men are dying, and it is the death that Jesus is going to swallow up in victory and destroy, which means resurrection of the dead. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even has Christ been raised, because that was the reason why he was raised, was to destroy the death that came through the man and its effects of death, of which we all experience. And that speaks to every one of us. This doctrine speaks to every one of us. The resurrection of the dead speaks to every one of us. And Paul is directly making a link. If there is no resurrection of the dead, if we have hope only in this life only, and continue on in some other form in the life to come, then Jesus has not even been raised. Our faith is completely futile, because our faith preaches the triumph over death in all of its forms, and nothing short of victory, where there is no more death, and all power and principality has been destroyed through Jesus Christ. And when he returns and destroys the last enemy, death, that will be ultimate and entire and complete victory. Okay, I'm ready to preach some more, but I got to stop because of time. Anyway, I hope you're having a good evening. I know I am.